Now that Bitcoin exists and we have a way out of their system, more and more people are choosing that. And inevitably, the good money will push out the bad. And so what I would predict is that most of the currencies in the world will fail in the next 10 years. And we'll see a world where almost every country is on a regional currency or Bitcoin, essentially. And a lot of countries will adopt the US dollar. And that will give the United States more power to print money.
Today, I'm excited to welcome Dave Bradley, founder of the world's first Bitcoin store in 2013, co-founder of All Bitcoin, and on the board of the Bitcoin Well. Welcome to the Bitcoin Edge, Dave.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. I'm going to start out by reading what's on your website because I think it gives a good background into your story. So you start by saying the strongest and best looking Bitcoin entrepreneur in Canada. You do know Ryan Reynolds lives there, right?
I don't think Ryan Reynolds counts as a Bitcoin entrepreneur, and I'm also much stronger than him.
Well, I'm not going to argue with that. I mined my first Bitcoin in 2010. In 2013, I opened my first Bitcoin business. It was a brick and mortar store called Bitcoin Brains. In 2018, I co-founded the iconic Canadian Bitcoin company, Bull Bitcoin. In 2020, I joined the team at Bitcoin Well to help take the company public. I eat a lot of steak, and I'm hoping my experience and perspective will be useful. I love that. Tell us, so you're an OG in the Bitcoin space. Tell us how you found Bitcoin so early and how your perspective has changed.
Yeah, I mean, I got into Bitcoin as a way to make more fiat, which I think is a pretty common experience. People look at it as a way to make some money. Most people in the world are kind of seeking ways to make money these days. And the idea that you could just save and that would be an effective strategy has gone completely out the window. So, just like everyone else, I was looking for a way to make a quick buck and took me down the rabbit hole.
So, quick buck, starting with mining isn't easy. How did you learn that? And then what came next?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it was a lot harder to figure out mining back then. You're pretty much piecing things together from forum posts, but it was a lot easier to make money in the mining industry back then, which is different now in that it's a very competitive space controlled by corporate giants with massive bankrolls, which I think was kind of inevitable. But back then, it was mostly just figuring out the technical details, and you could mine Bitcoin on a GPU. So that was kind of where I got started.
Do you still do mining?
I don't. I haven't mined in a few years. I'm still kind of involved in the mining industry. I've consulted with a few companies lately, and I try to keep my fingers in the pot, I guess, of mining, but not actively doing it myself. You need a really favorable power situation essentially to mine residentially at home these days, and I have normal North American residential power rates, so it wouldn't be feasible for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's get right into it. Bitcoin just reached an all-time high. Have you been waiting for a long time for this?
Not really. I've been through a few all-time highs at this point, and I find that I'm pretty emotionally detached from the price as compared to where I used to be, and I see a lot of my friends freaking out, and I actually had I had a plan. I think we hit 120,000 Canadian yesterday, but I had a plan for many years where I was going to sell a certain chunk of Bitcoin when the price hit 100,000, and this was kind of like my, taking some chips off the table idea. And at some point, I think it was really even last cycle when we started to approach 100K, and I started to get to think like what would I do if I sold that Bitcoin? Like I could buy a fancy car or something, and but like ultimately what I would end up doing, like most people, is trying to save it somehow, trying to invest it. And you know, where else would I put it? Like the logical conclusion would just bring me back to putting it into Bitcoin. So I've kind of gotten to the point where I'm not planning to sell my Bitcoin, and that has detached me a little bit from the whole price speculation. The main reason that it's relevant is we get a lot more buzz and we get more people coming in. And like I said, I was one of many people who get into Bitcoin with the idea that I want to make some more dollars. And every time we get a cycle like this, we get more of those people coming in who want to make some dollars and buy a yacht or something like that. And every cycle, some of those people who get in looking for a quick profit kind of get sucked down the rabbit hole and actually become Bitcoiners. And that's kind of like our path to growth. So like that I think is the only way that the price is really relevant to me at this point.
So after your 2010 mining journey, tell us about your Bitcoin journey from there.
Yeah, I mean, I was mining Bitcoin, and then I was meeting people on local Bitcoins and selling them Bitcoin, and so that's kind of where I got started in the Bitcoin industry. And in one way or another, I've been involved or directly selling Bitcoin since then, pretty much 2010, 2011, and that's what brought me to being a co-founder at Bull Bitcoin, one of the top Bitcoin exchanges in the world. Pretty well known, and then Bitcoin Well, which is a publicly traded company in Canada. And I've been selling Bitcoin one way or the other for, I guess, about 14 years now.
So you're selling Bitcoin. How has your perspective of Bitcoin changed?
I mean, like I said, when I first got in there, I was looking at it as a get rich quick scheme essentially, and there wasn't like the wealth of knowledge out there back then. There was no like I couldn't just pick up a Bitcoin standard and learn about the evils of money printing and put that into perspective with Bitcoin. And so a lot of the dialogue back then was around Bitcoin as a payment method and how it was a censorship resistant tool and all that stuff, which was great. But I didn't really understand the actual core important part, which is the fact that it's the remedy to money printing, which I believe is an entirely transformative force for the world. And I probably didn't get that until like 2015. It took me a while because we didn't really know what Bitcoin was back then. Most people, I don't think, really knew.
Yeah, that's true. But for some reason, you stayed in it, and you saw that it was more than just about making money. So speaking of money printing, we we were talking a little bit about governments. How do you think that the Trump presidency is going to affect Bitcoin adoption?
Um, I think it's going to bring some good eyeballs. Inevitably, like we've already seen Trump have his own crypto scam. It was good to see that it didn't go very well. He didn't raise a lot of money, but inevitably, I think we're going to see more of that. There probably will be another Trump coin. Um, there probably will be a bunch of sort of crypto finance bros who insert themselves into the Trump administration in some capacity and start to push the idea that, we need on-chain kitties or whatever the new thing is. And so I expect that it's going to go quite awry from the perspective of actually promoting Bitcoin. Um, I think it'll be a net positive compared to like, if we had a Kamala Harris regime. I expect that she would have pretty aggressively cracked down on any kind of freedom technology, and that would have included Bitcoin. So I think it's a definite net positive that we got Trump in there. He's not going to screw things up as much. Um, there's this general hope that people have that Trump is like this great savior, and I think a lot of that relies on some faulty assumptions. So Trump now is the president elect. He's been elected to be the leader of the single most evil organization that has ever existed in the history of the world. The United States government has caused more death and destruction and stolen more wealth from more people than any other organization in the history of the world by such a wide margin. And a new guy is not going to change that. He's probably going to take some steps towards what most of us would describe as sanity. We don't want more wars. Like I think that's a pretty obvious, um, broadly held ideal that almost every citizen of the civilized world would agree with, is that we don't want wars. Like we don't see a reason that we should be killing each other, and I don't see a reason that people on the other side of the world should be killing each other either. And I definitely don't think I should be paying for those people to kill each other. So I think we're going to take a step in the right direction in that sense. Um, I'm pretty cautiously optimistic about RFK and all of his health side of things. There's a lot of things that that are sort of turned against us in the world right now, and the health system and our food supply are some ways that we're being really actively attacked by the people who print our money. But the big question, I think, on that side is going to come from the fact that those forces, which once would have been described as the military industrial complex, now I believe are kind of like a large amalgamation that includes the military industrial complex along with the health industrial complex and the sort of subsidized food industry. Those are big forces, and so he's going to run into some problems. There are many Republican lawmakers who are now in charge who are taking money from those companies. So there's a good chance that we're going to see some pretty big headwinds there. But again, like I say, I'm cautiously optimistic that he's going to make some inroads. So I think we're going to see some positive movement that's going to make people's lives better on a day-to-day basis in the short term. And I really appreciate that, because the previous government and our government here in Canada and many around the world that are on the sort of like progressive side have been actively going in the opposite direction. Everything they do makes our lives worse. It adds bureaucracy. It steals money. And then when they steal the money, they actually spend it in ways that hurts us. So I think we're going to move a little bit away from that. It's kind of a natural pendulum, I think, between the power of authoritarianism and freedom, and the pendulum swinging a little bit back towards freedom. But at the end of the day, like I said, this is the single most evil organization in the history of the world, and this is an organization that is absolutely addicted to its core to the ability to print and spend money. So there's literally zero chance that Trump will end the Fed. There's no chance that he'll institute a hard money standard. There's no chance that he's going to cut off the never-ending spigot of money pouring into literally everything that essentially twists the incentives on every piece of our society. So I guess the short answer is I would say it's going to hopefully be a little bit better, but not transformatively different. And the lifespan of the United States as an entity and every other entity like it, which steals from us by printing money, effectively stealing our time, the lifespan of these entities is limited.
I think that's a very measured perspective. I appreciate that. So, how are things in Canada?
You know, we have one of the most cartoonishly absurd communist leaders in the world. He's got an approval rating that is so low that there's literally zero chance that if an election was held today, or really at any point in the future, he has no chance of winning another election. He's beyond unpopular. He's being supported by a coalition of like-minded left-wing money grabbers who are essentially in there for their own best interests. And if not for the fact that there's a deadline at some point between now and when the actual election has to be, which is about a year from now, wherein if the government in its current form makes it that far, every member of the serving government now gets a lifetime pension, and they're literally just coasting to try to get that lifetime pension. So it is like it's cartoonishly absurd that we have these small-brained megalomaniacs running the entity that pretends to have authority over us, and so it's quite ridiculous. One thing that is nice about Canada is that we do have actually probably the dumbest government in the history of the world. And that's saying a lot, because they're all quite dumb. They're all quite bad at doing anything. And so one of the main reasons why we actually have a little nook of freedom, especially here in Alberta where I'm at, is that the government's ability to step on our necks is limited by their severe incompetence.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, nobody would vote against giving themselves a pension for life or healthcare for life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a phenomenon where, in the world that we're in right now, it can be very hard to establish facts and truth. I've had some debates with people that are close to me about COVID and climate change and all these things that are these big issues, and I've kind of come to the conclusion that we can't really have reliable sources. When I've had those debates and tried to back up my arguments, the people that I'm talking to haven't respected my sources, and have basically told me that my arguments are not valid because they don't like those sources. And I would kind of say the same thing, right? Like if I'm getting my information from state-run media or state-funded media, I don't think that's a good source. And so we're in this conundrum where how do we establish the truth if not all of our sources are bad? And one of the things that I've found that I've been able to fall back on is the incentives. And so if you can see people's incentives, you can probably trust them to follow those incentives. And it's like you got a guy showing up at your door saying you need volcano insurance, and he promises there's a risk of volcanoes, right? It's this miraculous thing with climate change or COVID or any of these other government fear policies wherein it's like there's this very scary thing and we promise that it's real. We can't prove it's real, but it's definitely going to kill you unless you give me more money. And when when it's essentially put that way, you can follow the incentives pretty easily.
Yeah, that's very true. Incentives. So does Bitcoin change this? If we get
Yeah.
into a Bitcoin world, hyper Bitcoinization?
Yeah, I've been doing this bit. We're putting on a conference next Saturday, but one of the things that I'll be doing at that conference is it's called Bitcoin Fixes Everything, which is a bit of a meme, but it really when it comes down to it, you can kind of pick just about any problem in the world and look at it from the lens of incentives, and from there you can kind of start to understand why Bitcoin would fix that problem. And it's since I've been really thinking about this and I've been asking people to challenge me on this, of, give me a problem, I'll explain how Bitcoin fixes it. Um, it's really struck me that nearly every problem that we would describe as like a systemically bad issue with the world, where you're like, this shit's just not right, almost every single one of those in some capacity is created or exacerbated by the choices made by the government. And not only the choices that they make, but the choices that they make using the resources that they confiscated from us. And so when you remove their ability to confiscate those resources in an indirect way like that, it essentially you force everyone to put their incentives back on the table, right? So there were taxes before there was money printing, and a guy would have to come to your door with a gun and collect your money, and if that was paying for a war in a country that you have never been to and probably never will be to, the chances that the population in general would be okay with that tax collection were much lower. And most of human history, there was kind of a natural feedback method wherein when a ruler became too tyrannical and levied too high of a tax on his citizens, they would be killed. We've got the guillotines and the rope that were the check to the power that those people wielded. And even the creation of the United States was created over a minute, like a 2 or 3% tax on tea. And there was this idea that enough was enough, a point where the government takes too much, where the rulers confiscate too much of our resources and therefore too much of our time for us to put up with them, essentially. And what money printing did is kind of obfuscate that relationship to a point where they can now take as much as they want, and because it happens in an indirect way, they're able to blame all these other forces other than the fact that they're just stealing the value, right? You've got the US political system and really most political systems in the world that are kind of divided on this left-right scale. And really, when it comes down to it, all they're arguing about is how they spend the money that they steal, right? They're not really like there's no candidate saying we need to eliminate 90% of the federal government, which I think would be, the reasonable path. So it's really like this false dichotomy where they've created all these expectations on both sides, where the left thinks that it's the patriarchy and institutional racism and the police and the toxic masculinity that are causing all these problems in the world. And then on the flip side, you've got the right that thinks it's illegal immigrants from the coastal elite and the gays and whatever. And really, they just put these two forces at each other, and they're arguing over what's causing the problem. But the actual cause of the problem is the fact that the people in charge have stolen the money. It's pretty quite simple at the end of the day. And I think that's the real political spectrum, is the spectrum between freedom and totalitarianism. And the more of our money and wealth and resources that they take, which essentially is them taking more of our time, the closer it gets to totalitarianism. And we've obviously come way too far down that path in the last few years.
So what you're basically saying is the system is set up with our fiat money to, no matter what side of the spectrum you're on, is to steal our wealth, and having a sound money would fix that.
Yeah, exactly. We remove their ability to steal our time.
And for example, give us an example, the argument about climate. Jeff Booth says you cannot fix the problem from the system. You have to go outside. Is just a little example like that.
Yeah. I mean, climate is a pretty interesting one because it very much falls into that realm of like it's this very scary thing that they promise exists. And the solution to making sure that we don't all die, which is what they've literally been telling us is going to happen. Like there was a point where they were like, we're going to be under a foot of water by the year 2000, right? This alarmism has been going on for a long time. So at the face value, there's a lot of people, myself included, that are skeptical about all the science behind climate change and whether or not the climate is changing, which I'm sure it is. I don't know whether it's getting warmer or colder. I've seen good arguments for both, but I have no real reason to believe that humans are causing climate change or that matters. And so there's a big skepticism up front, and that goes back to the incentives. The people who are telling us this is a worry are the people that want money to fix it, right? So the incentives line up in such a way that it causes me to be skeptical. But if we suspend our disbelief for a moment and we look at the idea that taxes can solve climate change, we get really quickly into that incentive game, and we start to see that the taxes that they take, or the money that they print, are in fact going to things that don't really make sense, even in the context that they're trying to describe to us, right? If we were trying to really limit the amount of carbon that was going out there, or limit the amount of carbon that was in the world, like, trees would be a good solution, right? There are all these sort of manufactured solutions to a problem that we're not even really sure is real, frankly. And at the end of the day, like, if there is human caused climate change, and there is a path to fixing that, I'm very certain that the government will not be able to find that path or execute it properly, because just like everything else that they do, they're terrible at it.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And the only thing I like to say on the climate thing is, even if it's not changing and it's all natural, we still can protect the environment. We don't need to put plastic in the ocean, and we don't need
Yeah.
to, it doesn't help us.
Well,
That's the only thing.
part of the thing that also makes me skeptical about the climate change movement is that it is this giant global machine, and in a lot of ways, it's actually swallowed up the real environmentalist causes that I think most of us can identify with. And if you were to go back, you go back 30 years and you look at the face of environmentalism, the people who were in that movement were looking for clean air, clean water, save the whales, don't put plastic in the ocean. Like, I think these are things that, like, we can probably all get behind. Like, we want those things, right? We want clean air, and all of those problems have been kind of swallowed up by the one narrative. So it's also been very useful to those in charge that they no longer have to worry about protesters getting angry about smog or whale killing, because all of those people have been sucked into the climate change movement, and there's just been so much money poured into the climate change movement that it's sort of drowned out every other concern. And it always comes back to the incentives at the end of the day. And the incentive for the people in the climate change movement is to convince us the climate change is real so that they can consume more resources.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard you say that there's 100% chance that the government will seize MicroStrategy and BlackRock's Bitcoin from Coinbase one
Yeah.
day. My one question on that, and I want you to expand on it, but is, I thought BlackRock ran the world.
Yeah, I mean, kind of. Um, if you want to look at who runs the world, it's kind of a murky picture. I'm not really sure who runs the world. I know there are cabals of global elites that think they run the world, and I think they're losing some of their power recently. I think that the global elites use structures like the U.S. government. Generally speaking, the structure of the nation state is set up to siphon money away from average people into the hands of those global elites, and so um, that has been going on for quite some time. But the reason that I think ultimately this is going to come to a head is that the the ability of the United States government and every other nation state in the world to print money to infinity to fund all of these things is inevitably going to come to an end. Now that Bitcoin exists and we have a way out of their system, more and more people are choosing that. And inevitably, the good money will push out the bad. And so, what I would predict is that most of the currencies in the world will fail in the next 10 years. And we'll see a world where almost every country is on a regional currency or Bitcoin essentially, and a lot of countries will adopt the U.S. dollar, and that will give the United States more power to print money. When they print money, they siphon value away not only from their own citizens who are using the U.S. dollar, but everyone around the world who's using the U.S. dollar. And so I think the U.S. dollar is going to have the longest lifespan of any fiat currency out there in all likelihood. But at the end of the day, it's kind of just math, right? Unless they stop printing, which seems like absurd. They're not going to stop printing. Unless they stop printing, eventually they get to that Venezuela moment at some point, right? Where they're continuing to print to fulfill their addiction to spending. And at a certain point, people will stop taking the money that they can print. And at that point where, we saw that in Venezuela, the government of Venezuela very quickly started paying their military and police sort of Gestapo violence enforcement crew in U.S. dollars in the form of money that still was able to help to hold value. And when we get to that point with the U.S. dollar, when the U.S. dollar can no longer hold value, there's probably not going to be another fiat currency out there for them to jump to. There might be gold-backed currencies at that point. There might be some other options, but realistically, when the day comes that they can no longer print money to spend money, do you think they're going to stop spending money? Like they can't. They'll never stop spending money, and so inevitably, I think there will come a day when they launch a 6102 attack and essentially confiscate all the gold and all the Bitcoin, all the hard money that they can get their hands on, and they'll probably issue IOUs either denominated in Bitcoin or dollars that say the government of the United States owes you this, but you'll never get that value back. Right? Once they have the Bitcoins, which I believe is inevitable, that they'll confiscate them someday. They're just going to spend them.
But that's probably quite a long way off,
I
and
don't know.
you don't know.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, better to keep it in self custody.
Yeah. It's the term that we always hear is gradually then suddenly, and I expect that when that happens, when the day the U.S. dollar loses all of its value, it's going to be fast. Like it's going to be the kind of thing where like 3 p.m. on a Friday, a bank collapses because they realize that all the commercial real estate they've lent against is now worthless, and that bank, leads to the collapse of another bank, and you know, before the markets close in an hour, we have this cascade of 100 or more banks that have all died, and then they close, and now we have the weekend, and all of that sentiment builds up into a bank run, and people lose confidence in the system, and in the span of 3-4 days, the currency will go from being worth something to being worth nothing. And so I don't know how to predict when that will happen, but like I know that it's going to be a surprise the day that it does.
I mean, it sounds a little bit like a conspiracy theory to people not in Bitcoin, right? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it is a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory, but I think the interesting thing about the term conspiracy theory is that it's kind of become this demonized word that assumes that there isn't actually a conspiracy. And so we're putting forward a theory here about a conspiracy that we know for certain is real. The creation of the Federal Reserve and the road to printing all of our lives away is a conspiracy that is well documented, and we're living in the outcome of that conspiracy. So I think when you hear somebody say like that's a conspiracy theory, sure, but like, are they wrong? is the important thing. And I think we've seen ample evidence that the government itself is a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy to separate us from our resources. It's a conspiracy to steal our time and reallocate the wealth that we've created with our time in a way that they see fit. And that, it is a theory, but it's pretty well evident looking at the world these days.
Yeah, that's true. Many conspiracy theories end up coming true, so it's just a
Almost
theory.
all of them, actually,
Yeah,
these days.
yeah. Well, let's get to the solution. So tell us some of the biggest lessons that you've learned in Bitcoin.
I mean, I've learned a ton of lessons about running a business, and I've learned a ton of lessons about the nature of money. We're all kind of programmed uh, to fit into this sort of borrow and spend world, right? And it can be very hard and it can be very boring to just take the simple step of buying some Bitcoin and then not selling it. That's the hard part. Everybody thinks they're a genius. They can time the top, they can time the bottom, all this stuff. And at the end of the day, it really it really comes down to a pretty simple lesson. It's your time that you're storing, and if you don't want to part with the value you created with your time for something, don't spend your Bitcoin. It's a transformative thing, I think, that happens to many Bitcoiners is we all kind of become cheap because we start to think in like, like literally like if I had bought something with my Bitcoin 2 weeks ago, it would have cost me 20% more by now. And so you start to frame your purchasing decisions in that light. And I think that's part of that mindset shift is part of what is going to fix everything. It's the move away from this very disposable, quick, easy, cheap consumer society towards, for most Bitcoiners, if you want them to part with your Bitcoin and you want to sell them a product, you better sell them something good. You better sell them something that will last, so that they're not going to feel like they got shafted when their furniture breaks down 5 years from now, and the Bitcoin they would have otherwise owned is worth a whole lot more. So I think that's kind of the biggest shift for me. And then other than the great awakening that we've been talking about here, which is the awakening to the idea that the government is the problem, that's the single biggest thing that I think Bitcoin has shifted in my perspective.
Yeah, definitely going down that rabbit hole. There's a lot of lessons. So this comes back to that you don't focus a lot on price. 1 Bitcoin equals 1 Bitcoin. Does that also mean to you that Bitcoin is going to become a payments rail?
Yeah, I mean, there are the three elements of money, and store of value is kind of the core of those things. And so, in order to be useful as a medium of exchange, your money first has to be able to store value. And we're kind of in that spot where Bitcoin has demonstrated its ability to store value. It doesn't function very well as a short-term store of value because if you have your money in Bitcoin, who knows what the price is going to be 2 weeks from now. So it's kind of making that transition. And I think part of that transition is not only, people say Bitcoin may become less volatile, but really what's actually happening, I think, is the dollar and other fiat currencies are becoming more volatile. And so the value of Bitcoin is still and will continue to move pretty drastically compared to those things. But yeah, I think we're right in that transition period, and we're starting to see it. A lot of places around the world with circular economies developing, and it really stems from, in most cases, this idea that people are starting to identify the government as the problem, and they want ways to be able to transact without the government's permission or consent. And so, an example, we've got a market that we put on. Ben Perrin, BTC Sessions, spearheads here in Calgary every quarter. That's called the SAT market. And we get a bunch of vendors out. Everybody takes Bitcoin. Everybody buys a bunch of stuff off of each other, and the the uh, the source of that idea was the worry that at some point the government's probably going to come to us and say, you can't eat any more red meat, or you can only have a limit on red meat. And so, we started looking for ranchers that would sell us meat for Bitcoin and transact outside of the government's control or permission. And that kind of extends to everything else. Once you get going down the rabbit hole, is like, why do we need their help and permission to do any of these kind of transactions? And so, yeah, I think we're just living through the first days of Bitcoin becoming a medium of exchange.
Yeah, well, that's exciting. You mentioned, the health part and that you're a meat eater. Did you find that because of Bitcoin, or have you always been strong and healthy?
I mean, I could definitely be healthier. I don't eat a carnivore diet, for example, but I've definitely, like, I've always been a big meat eater, but you know, I was sort of infected with this idea, like most people, that meat wasn't necessarily the healthiest thing. I was like, I'm going to eat meat because it's delicious and it's worth it. And really, that all came from this same machine, right? It came from the government. The idea that meat is not what we should be eating is, if you look at the context of all of human history, it's obviously absurd, right? Like, meat has been the highest quality food and the most desirable food for literally every civilization in the history of the world. And at some point, because the twisting of incentives, we had a lobby group formed to try to sell us more canola and more corn. And those lobbying efforts created the idea that we should be eating this high sugar, high carb diet, and limiting meat. And you have organizations that are widely regarded as reputable, that the American Heart Institute, things like that, that really are just propaganda arms to sell us more toxic sludge.
Yeah, my background is in holistic health, so I never believed that meat was bad. However, meat that, well, let's say cows that are fed grain and kept in a cage, and chickens that are kept in a cage, is not nearly as good for you as eating organic, range free animals. So that's a difference too, but that's not a strong industry either. The organic industry is not a strong one either. I just wanted to ask you about the spiritual side of Bitcoin before we end. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot of crossover there. I think a lot of people who get into Bitcoin end up going down the rabbit hole of spirituality or religion in some capacity. I think both can be an awakening force. They can open your eyes to what's really going on in the world, and and get you on the path to challenging the power structures that are out there. Um, I do think that part of the reason that Bitcoiners end up getting into religion or spirituality is because it's just kind of more steps down the same path, right? When you start to think about all these concepts that we're discussing, the nature of money and how that links to our time, that very quickly leads into the idea of morality, wherein it's immoral, I would say, for somebody that I have not given consent to steal that value from me. And as you go down that path, you kind of get into philosophy and the nature of the world and the nature of the self, and all of that can lead very strongly towards spirituality, I think. So I think there's a big crossover there. And I would say that I'm more spiritual, certainly since I got into Bitcoin, more connected to God, or whatever you want to call the thing that we all know exists. um, and I've seen that in a lot of other Bitcoiners. I think that it puts into perspective um, what it means to be a human, and where we fit into the world in a way that leads to both introspection and the desire to look outward for meaning.
Yeah, I love the spiritual side. So tell us where people can find you, Dave, and also your conference coming up, because it sounds wonderful, and I'll get this out before then. It might help a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm on most social media as Bitcoin Brains. You can also visit my website that you mentioned at bitcoinbrains.com. There's a lot of important information about some of the stakes that I've eaten there, along with other things. And you can find this event that we're putting on. It's called Sovereign Minds. It's happening on November 16th, on Saturday, at Mount Royal University. And you can find the tickets at sovereignminds.ca if anybody is in the area and interested in coming. We're going to be discussing a lot of this kind of crossover stuff. We're talking about gold, Bitcoin, psychedelics, circular economies, healing, and freedom generally. So we're trying to bring in a lot of different communities that I think are kind of natural allies, people who should be talking about the same things and having cross conversations. And essentially, it's a whole bunch of topics that are interesting to me, and I think will be interesting to other people as a result. So I would love to see more people out at that on Saturday. And yeah, I think that's it. You can find Bull Bitcoin, Bitcoin Well online, and yeah, I think that's about it.
And these communities are freedom loving communities, right? That's what.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a big freedom community here in Alberta, especially the trucker convoy and the horrors of COVID kind of woke up a lot of people, and now we have a lot of people here who have at least identified the problem, which is the ever expanding, hungry, all devouring overreach of the government. And I'm hoping they're at least some of them are ready to hear what I think is the solution.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Dave.
Yeah, thanks for having me.